Welcome everybody to my TLX talk called Interactive Design. It's about enhancing the visual appeal and immersion of your world through active and passive interaction. Who am I? None of your business. So I'm Ruuubick. Oh, that's wrong. Here we go. Here we go.
Oh, we can draw on the slides.
Sabotage.
Yeah. Feel free to obviously unmute your microphone so that you can audibly laugh at my hilarious jokes, because as you can see, they are hilarious. I didn't know how to pronounce Preface, so Preface. My preface is, what is this talk about? It's basically about making the experience more appealing through active and passive interactions. As you will see in this talk, there's a lot of very simple things you can do to make your world, to enhance your world, whether it's visually or through the interactions. Next slide. Oh, I guess you can't. No, you can't. Okay. So why am I doing this? If you've ever gone world hopping in VRChat, if you've ever looked at the world that are published through the community labs, you've most likely encountered this issue where too many worlds are just empty. They're missing very basic things that you should be able to do in your world. There is very little things that make people want to go into your world and experience what you've made. So there's very simple pieces of the puzzle that people are missing out on, and we'll look at this talk to see what people can do and solve this issue. So there's a lot of examples that people have published. You can obviously go to people's worlds and see what people have made that is successful and works. And there's obviously very objective examples, ways of doing things that are better and will help you. How to start? When you start making a world, you should obviously have an idea what you're doing. And so that is the vision. You should obviously always write down your vision and deconstruct. And by deconstruct, you should know what the player should feel when they go to your world. You should know what the player should do when they go to your world. You shouldn't just expect the player to understand everything and all the concept you're trying to, have into your world. You should obviously, again, don't try and reinvent the wheel of what you're trying to do. A lot of people have done horror games, just fun, or in general, for the past decades. You don't need to try and, make up a new theme. You can just look at what people have made before and look at what works and what doesn't, and you should try and add this to your world. Objectivity, you should never rely just on yourself. You most likely have friends, you most likely have people or community around you, so you should reach out to those people to look at what you've made and see if what your vision is, if it works. Basically, you want to make sure that other people understand your concept, understand what you're trying to make, what you're trying to do. And so you should always rely on the people and get their perspective, because it's too easy to tunnel vision and to make something that only you understand, and that just doesn't work for other people. Ask for other people for help. You should check resources. There's a lot of places you can go to get things for your world. There's tutorials and groups you should reach out to as well. Basically rely on what's available for you all the time. So the first main piece of the talk is active interaction. Active interaction is just basically what the player is going to do. The player expects a response. It's just an active thing that people are going to do in your world. The main one is triggers. What are triggers and what do they do? They're just very simple pieces of interaction, the most absolute basic concept. You have an interaction with the world and the world reacts to it. Enabling more immersive concept and events. You just basically want to have pieces of your world rely on interaction for the player. It makes the player feel better about themselves. The player is in charge of the experience. You give people agency, and so that just makes your experience feel more interactive and immersive. We have a few examples of this. The first world is Club Gumball by Screaming Color. It's very simple interactions. It just point and click, on interact, trigger. Oh, okay, so it loads the next video. The next world is Moxie's Bar.
Mad Moxies?
Yes,
yeah.
By Jordo. So in this world, you basically have a very simple interaction, which has a randomized effect. So the interaction doesn't need to be only triggered once. Having an interaction that you can trigger multiple times and has a different result makes the interaction feel more interesting, because the player will continuously try and do the same thing over and over. But if they expect or receive a random result, then that action is still compelling, even if it's the same interaction. Play the video, please. Please, I just
Try next slide.
Oh, I just pressed next slide. Okay, fine.
How's that?
Yes. Next slide. So in this case, we have Orel's Mox Hideout. The interaction is based on the pickup, but every single pickup that you select has a different, interaction and different results. So it makes the people want to go around the world and interact with everything that they can. So you should not just rely on one single interaction for the same thing. And next slide, we have Vapor Planes by Centauri. Centauri is really good at this, but basically the interactions that you have in your world should not just be things that the player is going to expect or that make sense. You can completely do anything. It's actually better sometimes if you have an interaction that it is a total surprise for the player, because it makes it more compelling. If people can expect the result of every single interaction they're going to have to your world, at some point, it's maybe not necessary to just click on buttons if you already know what's going to happen. So how do you do triggers? The SDK, a lot of people don't know that. The VRChat SDK has a lot of, has one in, I think it's examples, scenes. You have a lot of scenes basically that show you everything that you can do. It has two specifically scene action and triggers that basically show you all you can do with triggers. It doesn't show you everything because, that would be a lot, but the most basic concepts are there. So if you want to understand how something functions, you just load these scenes and you can click on everything and see how that works. Tons of tutorials by people like Silent Laser, Wagon, Mode, The Monster, plenty others as well. But those tutorials specifically, those people specifically go through the most basic concept. And so if you want to have a visual understanding and people run you through the concept, well, check out those YouTube channels. The VRChat documentation goes also through a lot of very basic explanations and descriptions about what the triggers do. So check that out. And always, if you have troubles and you don't necessarily have a community, you can ask. Go and check out the VRChat Discord server, the main one. There are channels dedicated to help people, specifically for world or even avatars. The next concept is NPCs. So what are NPCs and what do they do? NPCs in your world improve the perceived quality. Because so little people are doing it in their world, if you see an NPC moving in a world as soon as you join in or is part of an interaction, you unconsciously think that the world is going to be higher quality, that the creator has a higher standard, or they've done a lot more work to their world so that this NPC is part of the experience. They make the world feel alive. Just having something in front of you when you join a world that moves is a lot more appealing than having a completely static scene. So if you can have NPCs, please do. If you're trying to tell a story, you should have NPCs. Your NPCs will tell the story for you. You don't necessarily need to have pieces of paper with text to read, because sometimes it's not the best kind of storytelling. It really depends on the world, but if you can have an NPC be the storyteller in your world, please do it. It's the best way to do it, honestly. And the illusion of crowd, you can only have so many people in a VRChat world. 80 is the maximum. So if you have a very large world, you can't have people everywhere, and so it will make the world feel empty. And so basically I'm saying basically a lot. If you have a crowd of NPCs in your world, it just fills up the world in a way that you couldn't do with players, and so use that as your advantage to make the world more visually appealing. The first example is Lacusa. You've always probably gone to Lacusa Lounge. You have NPCs that are part of the story. They are interacting, but also some of the interactions, like getting objects, rely on those interactions with the players. And so if you haven't been to that world, go to it. It's the best example, I think, in terms of making the world feel alive, because when you go to that world and leave, you subconsciously know that this world is going to keep, living on its own, because the NPCs are there and they interact between themselves. Next slide. We have Submerge 2. For Submerge 2, we try to do mocap and have an NPC be the storyteller at the beginning instead of having just text. It felt a lot more powerful in terms of storytelling, and so it is something that is very simple to do. Now with the tools that we have, if anyone has full body tracking, you have mocap capabilities, so you can do this. Next example is B Club, a new world, I guess, that surprised everybody, but B Club does a lot of things really well, and the NPC at the entrance is part of it. When you join an area and it looks like an entrance, if you have no one welcoming you, you feel bad. It's not crazy to imagine that if you walk into a specific place and the interaction that you would expect is not there, then the experience feels worse. So having an NPC that welcomes you, it's just a basic, on-enter trigger. But just having that makes the world a lot more appealing and feels like a reward almost for the player to join that world. So trying to do this if you can. Oh. I can't do previous 2. I can. There we go. In Frank, you have this NPC that basically goes around and lives his own life in the world. If you do something in the world, the NPC will react to it, but on his own. He has his own voice lines. He has his own tiny house where he hangs out. So the world is alive, even though you can technically do nothing. The NPCs will still have his own job, and so you can follow the NPC around to get different types of storytelling. How do you do NPCs? Mixamo. Mixamo is the best resource that we have available because it's free and it's simple to use. You probably heard of Mixamo, maybe used it yourself. You should always rely on Mixamo because there's a giant library of animations you can use and you can tweak yourself if you don't necessarily like what you get. But as the most basic thing, Mixamo is the best, so try and use it. I made a tutorial. Watch it, please. I think the tutorial is pretty good. It basically shows that if you have full body tracking, even if you don't actually have full body tracking, you basically have mocap available. And so if you want to make your own NPCs, if you want to record things, you can at any point. Just watch the tutorial and you understand it's pretty simple, the concept, but making NPCs at this point is something that you have the ability to do and is not technical. And so everybody should do it. You can make your own NPCs. For example, Centauri, in most of our worlds, the NPCs have been built specifically for that experience. And so you can just build a very simple robot or a character. It doesn't need to be humanoid all the time, and you can just make something simple that reacts to the player. Is better than nothing most of the time. Target tracking is basically look at constraint. That sometimes look at constraint that looks at the player is enough. You don't need to go to crazy length to have extremely complex and technical animations that react to the player and do things. You can just literally have an NPC look at you when you walk in specific places, and that's enough for the NPC to feel alive and reacting to you. How you have the assets, where to get those NPCs or animations, you have the asset store. Unity has a lot of stuff, way too much. And the internet too, is just so many resources. Mixamo is always the main choice and result, but generally you can find a lot of animations for NPCs on the internet. So next up we have pickups. What are pickups and what do they do? Pickups make the environment relevant. It's too easy to make a world and forget that interactions should only be something you can click or areas you enter. Pickups make the whole world way more interesting. You can also design your whole world interaction and concept around pickups to be required to interact and go through your gameplay. They give an avenue for roleplay. Just having the pickups in your world is what sometimes streamers or people who record themselves, or even just among friends, having pickups allow you to make up your own gameplay or make up your own stories. You can just have fun with the pickups. It basically gives a reason for people to stay longer in your world or try other things in your world. The pickups are also another layer of interactions. Like I said, you can interact with other players, but you can also interact with the world and its pieces. And so if the player were to find an interaction in your world through a pickup, they would feel rewarded to have picked up that object in the first place and then went through your world to try and find a secret interaction. And so try and think of all the interactions that people might expect with a pickup specifically and build around that. And lastly, they need to match the world. Too many people try and just bring, for example, the pen prefabs in their world, and it clash so heavily visually in terms of color, in terms of gameplay. Think about the prefabs and the pickups you have in your world in terms of visual parity, in terms of visual, coherence, I guess. They need to match what you're trying to do visually, otherwise it instantly breaks the immersion. If you're walking through the scary woods and then you have a glowing red pen, it makes no sense. So think about it that way as well. So good examples of pickups. We have devouring. Devouring had pickups that were not necessarily tied to the gameplay, but part of red herrings. Obviously, you had all the pickups that were required to go through the world, but a lot of the pickups in the world, I think most of the pickups in the world, didn't do anything. That just made you think about what you could do with them, and that engaged you into thinking more critically about all the use cases you could have in the world. So try and sometimes have pickups in your world, game world, that don't necessarily do anything, except maybe lead the player onto different paths that they might take. The next example is Finn's latest Aquarius. You have the plushie shark that in itself doesn't really do anything aside from being a nice pickup that brings comfort, and you can, having pictures with yourself. And on the other side, you have the tablet, which has a very specific purpose, which is educational. And so it's a really big contrast in between the two pieces, the shark and the tablet. So your world doesn't need to necessarily have one type of pickup. You can have pickups that actually do nothing, objectively, or have a very specific purpose. And so different types of users will have different use cases for those pickups.
You forgot the fidget spinner.
And the fidget spinner, very, very useful in that world. I cannot click. There we go. In the case of Tsubokura Home by Kohaku, the pickups are there specifically for the player to use in terms of RP, because you have the camera behind you. The pickups were put there so that people would record themselves with it and have interactions with them. And if you've ever been on Japanese Twitter, you most likely came around and saw a video on taken in that world of people using specifically those pickups for that purpose. So if you want people to do things in your world in terms of marketing and being on Twitter, recording videos, etc., you might want to have specific pickups that make the player want to do specific actions, like in this case, role play with the headsets and the trackers. In the last example, this I forgot the name of the world, but by Latiprod, I think.
Flowers.
Oh, thank you very much. And so in this, in this case, the gameplay relies specifically on the pickup. You have to pick up the musical object to interact with the rest of the world. So if you're thinking in terms of gameplay, just having a pickup that is required to be used, then you can base your whole concept around this, and that makes the whole environment more compelling. So how do you do pickups? They can be very easy or complex. You can have very simple pickups that basically is an object that has the pickup component, and that's it. Or you can go extremely complex, where the pickup itself will have its own interaction when you drop it, when you click it. The pickup can also have, disallow theft for specific gameplay purposes. You can have it being held automatically. The pickups can do, anything you kind of want it to do. So you can go, ham on the interactions. It has lots of settings, and that allow you to do those complex interactions. I just basically talked through the whole thing. Next up, we have UI. So what is UI and what does it do? The UI enables different types of interaction in your world. As we'll see in the next videos, the UI is not necessarily just a static environment piece that ties into the world and allows you to do things. The UI pieces can also be part of the world experience. And if we look in the videos, please. Thank you very much. In the world,
Silent Creek.
Was Silent Creek by Legends. Thank you. In this case, this UI specifically, it's not just gameplay. It's also marketing. It's also world settings. So the UI doesn't necessarily need to look the same for everything. You can have UI pieces specifically designed to have their own purposes. And so you should think about that in terms of UI, where it matches into the world. And so if you want stuff to stand out, you need to make it stand out, not because it's a UI. In the case of Finn's Aquarius, the UI quality is insanely high, but because it matches so well in the world, it doesn't stand out on its own. It's only when you interact with it that it actually makes sense and look very high quality. So think of how you want to make your UI stand out. It's not necessarily how it looks, but it can just be how you interact with it and what it does. Well, here we go. In the last example, this is Omori. I think this is a latte prod. And so in this case, the UI specifically, cool, thank you. In this case, the UI is tied around the gameplay. It makes sense with the theme of the world. It is based around what the UI looks like in the game. So if you're going for a very specific concept, you probably want to design your UI in terms of interaction and visuals as to what people would expect in terms of what the theme of the game or the world you try to build, because that just rewards people visually and through interaction. So that is necessary. So how do you make UI? You can make your own. It's pretty complex. There's a lot of tutorials for it, but more generally, you would want to find existing prefabs. If you do find a prefab, please don't just put it down in your world and move on with it, because, like with pickups earlier, if you were to drop a prefab in your world, it will most likely not match the visual theme of what you were going for. Again, think of your vision. So if you do get a prefab, try and change the UI and its pieces so that it actually doesn't stand out in your world for the wrong reasons. The Unity Asset Store also has the prefabs of Unity UI pre-made, so you can try and get those if you can, and you can try and again mess with them so that it match. Games. So games, again, prefab, they are objectively fun. You've probably seen that most worlds now have a pool table. It's for very good reasons, because it's objectively fun and people enjoy that experience. And games can also, in your world, if you have if the world is lacking in terms of interactions on purpose or not on purpose, you can just put down games, because it makes up for the missing pieces of the interaction spectrum. So you might want to rely on games specifically if you're trying to make a hangout world. And speaking of a hangout world, you have I forgot the name of the world, by Zixa. I think Zixa's apartment. Thank you, Zixa's apartment. So you can see that the games exist in the world, but they have their own areas specifically. Visually also, it ties into the colors of the games. So it's not because you put down a game in the world that it will suddenly make sense. You have to be careful about where you put that game in your world so that it's not disruptive in terms of social interactions with other people or visually with the rest of the visual appeal in your world. In the case of the ballroom by Fiona for the Prefab's birthday, we had a specific area in the world that was far away from the interaction places so that people could still play games, but it was far away of the rest of the group so that we wouldn't disrupt or bring people in with those games. So think of the placement and the, again, visual style, because as you can see, the prefab was changed, the colors were changed to match the environment. So it just makes it look even better. So how do you do games? Prefabs everywhere, literally. Prefabs database. In the bottom right corner, you can see the logo. It's what you're going for. Patreons. There's a lot of games on Patreon specifically. So they might cost money or they might not. It really depends on the creator. And Booth also has a lot of games in prefabs form that you can get and drop into your world. And at this point, with Udon, it can do a lot. So if you want to make a game, it's very likely that you can. At this point, the difficult part is making it a prefab and that it becomes shareable. You don't necessarily need to, but I think it's the best way at this point to get people to use what you make. So yeah, that's a great avenue for this. Active interactions recap. We have triggers, NPCs, pickups, UI, and games. If you can, try and have at least some of those pieces in your world. It doesn't need to be everything, but just take into consideration, and depending on your vision, what you want to do, what you're trying to achieve. I just noticed that the timer did not start, so I don't know how much time I have, but we'll see. The next big topic is passive interactions. This is the opposite of the first main topic. Passive interactions is anything that the player was not meant to be doing, if the player wasn't expecting, things that will play in the world regardless of the player's interaction and experience. The first world in this is the first piece of passive interaction is post-processing. Post-processing, if you don't have post-processing in your world, you're probably making a mistake, unless you're on Quest, obviously. Quest doesn't support post-processing. But if you have a theme in your world visually, or in terms of gameplay, you probably want post-processing to be the cherry on top visually of what you're trying to achieve. You need to rely on post-processing and not the default post-processing, obviously. It's a clear visual quality boost if you just drop that into your world. And you can also, you obviously use post-processing as a gameplay element as we will see next. So this is Noir by Centauri, or Centauri. The world wouldn't basically make sense if it wasn't for the post-processing. It ties the whole visual appeal of the world. It basically makes everything black and white, or specifically for those colors, I believe yellow and red stand out a lot more, and that's how you tie gameplay into your post-processing. You can make visual elements of interactions stand out through the post-processing. So make sure to use that for its purpose. In the case of Acalink Encrypt of the Spirit, Acalink wanted to have specific post-processing volumes and presets when you went from one area to another to basically make a visual checkpoint and make the player understand that they were going through a different type of area and the gameplay was going to change. So it can be subjective, or it can be conscious or unconscious, depending on how strong it is. But I think if you want to make the player understand without telling them directly or just through text, post-processing is one of the best options you have. For Hangout World as well, you have, if you've been to a Hangout World, you probably saw that they have a menu specifically dedicated to post-processing. In this case, I believe Spirits of the Sea by Mikey has presets predetermined. I'm going to ask to the people in the audience, raise your hand if you use post-processing in your world. All right, so that's most people. Lower your hand if you do not use temperature, if you do not use saturation and contrast. Yeah, okay. Pretty much half of the people lowered their hand. You need to use temperature, you need to use contrast, you need to use saturation, because temperature will literally make the player, as soon as they join into the world, understand, I'm going to use the word vibe, but yes, they will join your world and basically understand what theme, what environment, what feeling you're trying to go for. If your world is a hangout world and you want to be chill, you probably want to go for a lower bluish type of color in your world. If you want the opposite, then you probably want to be more reddish on the hot color. So think of post-processing in terms of subconsciously telling the player what you want them to feel, and they'll probably go with it. So how do you do post-processing? VR World Toolkit. Get it in your project immediately, instantly. You have a button that just automatically installs it for you. If you don't do that, you're just doing it, making it hard on yourself. It's the best way to do it. Silent Guide on post-processing for VRChat goes through all the things that you should and shouldn't do with post-processing. A lot of people try and use, for example, ambient occlusion, and that can just be for gameplay element or just because they are a VR player, a desktop player. Don't do that. There's a lot of things that you should not be using for very specific reason. And so Silent will tell you in her guide as to why the things you should be using. Fuck around with it. It's not complete strict down science. If you want to have post-processing in your world and you want to do something cool with it, try it. Again, ask for people and their subjective and objective view on it. But have fun with it, basically. Music and sounds. What are they and what do they do? Music and sounds in your world improve interaction, and they add to immersion. If you join a world and there is no music and no sounds, you're most likely going to be disappointed and bored, and you're going to not expect better interactions in the future. Your world should have music immediately when you join. It sets the tone for what you're trying to achieve. It tells the player what the pace is going to be in your world. It's not difficult to find music, so you should always have it. Music is just also purely satisfying. If the music is nice, you've probably been to Aquarius by now. People would go to Aquarius just to listen to the music in the background. Good music is just nice to listen to, and that works for well as well. Music is also very cheap, depending on where you get it, but obviously you can get it everywhere. Music doesn't necessarily need to be made for your world. You don't need to make it yourself, but if you like a specific song, you can try and add it to your world. Music is cheap but necessary. It's not because it's simple to add in your world that it's an afterthought. You should have music as part of your world. I don't know how many times to repeat it, but your world should have music and sounds. So the best thing that someone has made that is Flowers right in his Obsession world. Okay, it's a bit hard to hear through the thing, but basically this is a horror world. And the first interaction that you have in the world based on music is a trigger that says this is the loudest sound that is going to be played in the world, so adjust your volume based on that. Every single world, game world or horror world, should be doing this. This is the best thing anyone has done. And I don't know why everyone is not doing it. It makes sense, so try and do that as well. This is Hook Junkers by Blue Aces in Phase Dragon. This world is awesome because every single thing you do has a sound as a passive, like indirect and passive reaction. When you fly at high speed, you get the sound of the wind. When you hook onto something, there's a sound. When you have your hooks over something that you can grab, there's a sound. Everything in the world, when you land, there's also a sound. Everything has, it just makes you feel good when every single interaction you have with the world has a consequence to it. And so if you can do it, try, because in this case, Blue Aces, I believe, made Foley for most of the sounds, meaning that he recorded himself doing sounds and then applied those to the world in a way that made sense. In this next case, we have Dooley. What is the name of Dooley's world? Snugpad, thank you very much. And so in the case of Hangout worlds, you still can have the same effect. Outside, we had the sound of the campfire, we had the sound of the wood. You can, when you step on the ground, you have the sound of the rain, you have the water here. Even in Hangout world, you can still have, you can let people determine what the vibe of the specific area you're in based on what the sounds and the music is playing. So it's not just for game worlds. You should also be thinking of that in terms of Hangout worlds. So music and sound, how you do it. The internet, generally, you can find a lot of stuff for free. Yeah, free sounds. That is a very great piece of resource, unless you're trying to find sounds of dogs, because people apparently like making their own sound of dogs, and that's pretty weird. Please make your background music 2D. If your world sound, as the music generally in your world is 3D, maybe it's just for me, but subjectively, it breaks my immersion instantly because I can tell where the sound is coming from, and that sucks because I'm just always going to pay attention every time I'm rotating. Going to play area. So I know that it's kind of the SDK's fault because it tells you that you need to add a spatialization component and you don't want to make the SDK sad. Don't listen to it. Don't add the spatialization component. Otherwise your sound is going to be 2D and then it's 3D and then it's ruined. Sound are cheap. They need to be coherent. You can add every single sound you want in your world, but if they're too loud, too quiet, if they're too high-pitched, if they're too fast, if they don't make sense with the interaction you're trying to do, that will be instantly incoherent for the player, and that will just break their immersion, or at least for some time. But you need to be conscious about everything that the player expects, and so pay attention to it. Also refer to Akalink's TLX talk from December. It's really good, and there's a lot of points that you should be looking at in terms of making audio for your world specifically as well. Sounds. Next up, we have skyboxes. What are skyboxes and what do they do? Skyboxes is an essential visual piece of your world. If your world doesn't have a skybox, you're missing again on one of the main points that should be instantly in your world. Unconscious and passive interactions with the player. It immediately tells the player what they're supposed to feel like, what the experience is going to be like. Obviously, it doesn't work for every single world because not every world has a visible skybox, but if you have a visible skybox when you join a world, that skybox should make sense and should be instantly be a piece of interaction. It distinguishes your world from others. Too many times, as you can expect, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands at this point, of people are trying to make a VRChat world. What do they do first when they need a skybox? Free skybox in Google. What do they get to? Probably one of the few first pieces that they can find. And so if you're trying to make a world right now, and if that's what you're doing, your world is most likely using a skybox that thousands and thousands of other worlds are using. And so if you join a world and you can, over time, pay attention to the skybox and notice that it's the same skybox across world, it's going to take away from the immersion. People are going to try and link other worlds that are not yours to yours, and they will make like unconscious connections to your world that should not exist. So trying to make your skybox stand out. It's also theme continuity, as we'll see in some of the videos. You should be using, if you make multiple worlds that have the same theme, you shouldn't be using the same similar skybox. In this case, we have the Cyberpunk Abandonment by Floethar. This is obviously a skybox from the game Cyberpunk 2077. It looks 2D in this case in the video, but honestly in VR it looks almost 3D. It works extremely well. You should be using skyboxes from games like that if you can, because it honestly saves you a lot of trouble. But it also has all the pieces like lights, effects, just for free. You don't need to necessarily have a skybox you made yourself. In the next case, we have Paper World by Smooth Octopus. The skybox is in the background. You can always see it, but on top of that, what Smooth Octopus did was create pieces of geometry that they added at the very back. Is foreground, background the opposite of foreground? Probably background. And so those pieces are very far, but you can almost think that those pieces are part of the skybox themselves. So if you're trying to enhance your skybox, it doesn't necessarily to be painted on the skybox. You can also have meshes that are very far away, very big, but also are part of it, the environment background. This is the world A Wise Departure. And in the background, you can see that the castle looks very far away and very big. But as you get closer, the perspective is broken. It's not a big deal because the initial reaction you get to it when you join into the world is that it works. So it doesn't matter if it's broken afterwards, as long as the initial reaction is that it looks cool. People are okay with breaking pieces of the environment like that. And so earlier I mentioned theme continuity. These 4 worlds are made by Legends. You can probably notice what I'm talking about in these screenshots. Hard to see in the bottom left corner, but still, Legend skyboxes will always have a gigantic moon in them. And so if you are a popular creator, if you make content over time, you should basically start recognizing some of the pieces that Legends has that are theme continuity. So you can probably say, oh, this has a very big moon in the skybox, maybe Legends made it, and so you'll have to check. And so you can advertise on yourself in that way through the skybox and some of the elements you choose to make more visible and appealing. So how do you make skyboxes? The Unity Asset Store has a lot of skyboxes. I don't know how many free it has, but if you want to spend a few dollars on skyboxes, I think it's one of the best purchases you can make. The internet has a lot, but again, everybody uses the internet as their first pieces of content finder. So if you're trying to go for a skybox, you'll probably be using a skybox that someone else has, or if not, thousands of people have. You can make your own, obviously. It's not too difficult. It's still, skybox is still an image, so it's worth trying. But if you do get a skybox from the internet or Unity Asset Store and you're worried that it might already have been used, or if you already know that it's been used, try and customize it. It's an image you can add. You can draw onto it. You can add pieces by just, any image editor. So it's worth doing in all cases. The next piece is animated environments. So what are they and what do they do? Animated environments are very, very easy. It's oftentimes just a very simple animation, but they have a very strong visual appeal because it's something that players, when they join a world, immediately notice. It's, again, very simple, but it has an immediate reaction. But it's not necessarily something that people pay attention to. It's just always there, and so it's continuous visual appeal for people. Also, when people notice, it encourages paying attention to other places, because if you do notice that something is animated in the world, you might going through the world might think that other pieces are also animated, and so you want to keep trying to pay attention to see those. One of my favorite worlds, which is the Junkyard by Blue Aces, a lot of those pieces are animated. It's a bit difficult to see in the video, but basically the clothing rack, the piece of cloth in the background, there's a fan. Oh, instantly. There was a fan in the background, and there was also the windmill that was moving. All of those are very simple animations, but they work really well because they tie the whole world together and give it a strong visual appeal. If I play next slide. This is Deep Blue by Fins. Again, very simple animations of the boat rocking on the side. You have the trees moving with the wind. You have the plane going across the world every, I believe, 5 minutes. And you have the shark that goes around as well. I don't know why videos are playing by themselves. It basically is very simple animations, but if you time them in a way that requires the player to stay in your world for a long period of time and then notice, it makes the player feel rewarded about staying in your world. So they will also tell people to go in your world and stay for a long time to notice those kinds of interactions and pieces of the environment. So think about that in terms of if you want the users in your world to remain there for quite a long time, you can reward them by having pieces of interaction. So in my world, Dota 2, because I was bringing something that already existed outside of VRChat into VRChat, initially I was okay, satisfied with having just the world. Can I just...
You can replay and pause it.
Okay.
Just
Pause.
the video. Yeah.
In this case, I already knew what people would expect if they went into my world because, you know, Dota is a game. It has pieces of the environment moving, so I knew that I had to take those pieces and put them into the world and animate them so that if a player of Dota 2 went to join my world, they would get that same feedback that they get from the game, and they would get the pieces that they expect from my world. Because if everything was static, it would be pretty boring. So not much to do. In the case of the Frog Pond by Fiona and company, we have an environment that is animated mostly through very simple particle systems. Oh God. Next slide. Next slide. Pause. Most of these visual environment pieces are basic particle systems, and so it doesn't necessarily need to be animations. It can also be particle systems. And so I hope that Fiona eventually will have a tutorial for that, because it's really impressive all you can do with just the basic particle system. But all the things you see right now are just not animated. They're just particle system meshes that go around with sub-emitters. So it's extremely impressive. Animated environment, how do you use them and how do you make them? Again, basic Unity animations. Most oftentimes, if you have an object that is supposed to rotate on itself, all you need to do is create an animation, set a few keyframes for the object, enable auto recording, rotate the object, get that animation controller component, drop the animation in, voila, you have an animated element in your world. Very simple. It doesn't need to be crazy. It can just literally be moving around itself. Again, if you do this, remember that you need the sound to go with it to be coherent, because if an object is moving around, it probably has a sound, and if it makes a sound, well, the player is going to expect a sound. Particle system, as I explained, very simple, but you can also do some crazy shit like we saw just before. It doesn't need to be too crazy, but I think most people don't understand the power of particle systems. And you have obviously cloth that's part of Unity, wind through shaders. I believe Silent has a very good shader that does that. So check out Silent's booth. Shape keys, don't go overboard with shape keys, because scene mesh renders that have shape keys that are continuously enabled is not good for performance. So only do that for very specific pieces. And of course, OBJ sequence, something I discovered recently, but Vaughan made an extremely cool tool for Udon specifically. You can make an OBJ sequence in Blender, export that to Unity, and have it usable in Udon. And the results are awesome and extremely cheap. So I recommend everybody to try it. It's really awesome. Next again. Ooh, NPCs again. Where the fuck are NPCs? We go to so many worlds. So many worlds can have NPCs. If you have a town, if you go to a house, if you go to literally a bar in VRChat, why aren't there NPCs? They should be everywhere, honestly. NPCs is super cool. Because so little people are actually doing it, it was very hard to find examples of that to put into my talk. I went through so many worlds, even over the years, barely any world does it, and it's so disappointing because it would enhance the quality of your world instantly so much. Come on, yeah, it's way too easy at this point to make animated NPCs, so you should be doing it. Again, we'll see why, but in this first case, we have the classic criminal bar by Pixel Witch. We have just two NPCs vibing. They're just smoking a cigarette. Oh, it's fine. Okay. Whoop. They're just there. They do their own thing. They're not necessarily interacting with you. They're just not part of the environment. I mean, they're just part of the environment, but they're moving. And so just having those two NPCs that are there, that are pretty simple, but humanoid, it just makes the whole world completely believable and interesting. And you unconsciously raise the quality of this world by seeing those two NPCs there. So again, doesn't need to be crazy animation. You don't need to make them do backflips. Just having them smoke their cigarette is enough for the whole thing to make sense. And so that's what you're trying to achieve in your world. Next up, we have Space Gangsters by Fiona and Hi. Play video. Next slide, I guess. all these NPCs are doing their thing. They're part of the experience. Obviously, you can interact with them, but by default, they already do what they were made for, and so they just go around. And if it wasn't for them, the world would be a lot less interesting. But because they exist, I'll forget every single time. It's fine. And do it. Those NPCs, yeah, basically part of the environment, and so the obviously for someone who's a beginner, making all these NPCs would be pretty difficult because they were made from scratch. But again, it doesn't need to be crazy. Humanoid, it can be aliens like that, it can be robots, and so having them just move around the world, and it's not just the aliens, it's also the car, this particle system in the world. You should really check out this world because it does a lot of things that people don't think about. But in its entirety, the visual appeal is extreme because everything reacts to the music and it reacts to you as well. Yes. All right. So this world is Dark Waters by Ghostly. Everybody instantly recognized that this is a polygon asset pack. Yes. You see it everywhere in VRChat. It's not interesting. Everybody's done it. Every time there's a new polygon pack asset, it's instantly uploaded in VRChat. Not necessarily interesting. But in the case of what Ghostly has done, you have NPCs that are also part of the polygon pack, but those NPCs exist in the world and just interact with themselves. They just have basic looping animations, and just with that, instantly you're like, okay, fuck the polygon asset pack. This world is going to be interesting because it has NPCs. This tells me more about what types of world this is going to be. The quality, again, is higher than anything I would have expected by just going with the polygon asset pack. So you can surprise the player by having, in this case, it's the polygon asset pack, so you know what people might expect from it. Because it's always the same thing, but no, in this case you have animated NPCs as part of the environment, and it just makes it makes the whole thing a lot more interesting than it would otherwise have been. So yeah, very basic animations, mix them all probably, but same slide as earlier, NPCs, mix them all. I made a tutorial. If you have full body tracking, you can do your own recording. It's super simple. If you have any question, please ping me anywhere and I will help you. You can make your own NPCs. And obviously target tracking through the lookat constraint doesn't need to be crazy. Next slide. Whoa. Passive interaction recap. You have post-processing, sound, skyboxes, animated environment, and NPCs. Again, you don't need to do absolutely everything in this list, but consider if you have a world and you have a vision, you should probably consider all those and probably do at least a few of them to make your world visually appealing and immersive. And so this is the end of my talk. Question time. If you need to reach out to me, thank you very much. I have a few tutorials on my YouTube channel. It's not too crazy. I'll do more in the end because it's pretty nice, but you can reach out to me in all those places. I'm always available in the VRChat main Discord. If you need anything in terms of avatar or world, ping me there and I will help you, or at least do my best. But that's it. I hope this was informative and helpful. Question time.
Yeah, we are exactly at when the break should supposed to start, but we can obviously extend a bit into the break. Ooh. So if people have questions, feel free.
It says 37 minutes, so I assume it worked at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I measured it, and the next talk should start at 5, exactly. So we have 15 minutes until then. So if anybody has questions, feel free to ask.
I need to find the next speaker as well.
Clearly, you were.
Well, if no question, that means my talk was absolutely perfect and answered every question you might have. Thank you very much.